Not far from where Paris stands today, buried in the gentle farmland of what's called the Paris Basin, archaeologists found an ancient burial ground, a quiet, ordinary-looking field that turned out to hold an extraordinary story once scientists knew how to read it properly. It's called Gurgi, and the people buried there lived roughly 6,000 years ago. For a long time, historians assumed something simple and comforting about places like this. They assumed the people living in a region stayed there generation after generation, slowly changing their customs but always remaining, at their core, the same population, passing down the same land and the same stories from parent to child without any real interruption. Ancient DNA has now told us that assumption was wrong. Not just wrong in some small way either, the way a minor historical detail might turn out to be slightly off once new evidence comes along. The people buried at Gurgi were, in a real and measurable sense, wiped from the family tree of the region within just a few generations. Strangers took their place. And it wasn't the only time it happened near Paris, which is really what makes this particular story so worth telling in full. Let's take this slowly, because the story itself unfolds in two separate acts, thousands of years apart, and both of them involve the same basic pattern, one worth keeping in mind as we go through each part in turn. A settled population, a sudden change, and genetic evidence showing that the newcomers, whoever they were, had almost no blood relation to the people who came before them, a finding that quietly rewrites what we thought we knew about this peaceful stretch of French countryside. The first act takes place around 6,000 years ago, in the early days of farming in this part of France. Before farming arrived, this region was home to hunter-gatherers, people who had lived off the land for thousands of years without permanent villages or large-scale farming. Then, gradually, farming spread into the area, carried largely by descendants of migrants who had originally come from the eastern Mediterranean many centuries before. These early farmers settled into the Paris Basin, built their communities, buried their dead carefully, and appeared to be a stable, ongoing population. Let's slow down here for a moment because it helps to understand a bit about farming's early history in Europe, since this is the foundation everything else in this story rests on. Farming didn't begin in Europe. It began much further east, in a region we now call the Near East, in places like modern-day Turkey and Syria, somewhere around 10,000 years ago. Over the following few thousand years, farming slowly spread westward across Europe, carried largely by the descendants of the people who had first developed it, rather than simply as an idea that neighboring hunter-gatherers picked up on their own. By the time farming reached what is now France, it had already been spreading, generation after generation, for well over 2,000 years. The farmers who eventually settled the Paris Basin, then, weren't recent arrivals themselves. They represented a long, gradual migration that had been slowly moving across the continent for a very long time before finally reaching this particular region. That's where the burial ground at Gurgi comes in. Researchers studying the DNA from skeletons found there discovered something they didn't expect. Somewhere around 4300 BCE, a very specific and very short window of time, the genetic makeup of the people living in this area changed dramatically. The population buried at Gurgi carried ancestry that didn't closely match the earlier farming population that had lived in the same region only a few generations before. In plain terms, one group of people, farmers who had called this land home, were largely replaced by a different group of people, arriving from elsewhere, who left almost no trace of blending with the population already there. It might help to explain one more thing before we move forward, something that often surprises people who are new to this kind of research. You might wonder how scientists can pull usable DNA out of bones that are thousands of years old, bones that have been sitting in the ground for so long. The answer lies mostly in teeth. The inside of a tooth, protected by hard enamel, turns out to be a remarkably good place for DNA to survive for a very long time, sometimes tens of thousands of years, as long as conditions in the soil aren't too extreme. Scientists carefully extract a small sample from inside the tooth. Using techniques developed mostly over just the last 15 to 20 years, they can piece together enough genetic information to compare one ancient person's ancestry against another's, even across a gap of many thousands of years. This technology is genuinely new, and it's the reason we're only now able to tell stories like this one, stories that were sitting quietly in the ground the entire time, waiting for the right tools to finally reveal them. If that sounds surprising to you, you're in good company. It surprised the researchers too. Before we go further, if you're enjoying learning about what our ancient DNA can tell us about these kinds of hidden events, please consider hitting that like button. It helps this channel keep bringing you stories like this one. So who were these new arrivals? The genetic evidence points to a population connected with something archaeologists call the Mickelsburg culture, a farming tradition that appears to have spread into the Paris Basin from further west, bringing its own distinct genetic ancestry with it. This wasn't simply new pottery or new tools showing up in the same old community. This was, according to the DNA, a meaningfully different group of people, arriving and becoming the dominant population in the area within a remarkably short span of time. Now, it's worth pausing here to explain exactly how scientists can even tell something like this happened, since this might sound like a very bold claim to make from old bones. When researchers study ancient DNA, they can look at very specific genetic markers, ones that get passed down from parent to child. By comparing these markers across skeletons buried at different times, even just a few generations apart, researchers can see whether the people from a later time period are closely related to the people from an earlier time period, or whether they represent a largely different genetic population altogether. It's a bit like comparing family photo albums from two different decades. If the faces, the family resemblances, are completely different from one decade to the next, that tells you something important changed, even if you don't know exactly why. At Gurji and at other Paris Basin sites studied alongside it, that comparison showed a clear and sudden shift. The population living in this specific region before this event and the population living there immediately after it simply did not match up as close relatives the way you'd expect if the same families had just continued living there, generation after generation. This alone would be a remarkable finding. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting, because ancient DNA research tells us the same basic pattern happened again in this exact region, thousands of years later, during what's often called the Bronze Age. Around 4,500 years ago, a new wave of people began moving into large parts of Western Europe, including France, carrying ancestry that had originally come from much further east, from grassland regions stretching across parts of modern-day Ukraine and Russia. Archaeologists refer to this movement as the bell beaker phenomenon, named after a distinctive style of pottery shaped a bit like an upside-down bell that shows up in graves across a huge stretch of the continent during this period. For a long time, historians debated something important about this pottery. Did it spread because people liked the style and copied it from their neighbors, the way a popular clothing trend might spread today? Or did it spread because actual people carrying this pottery with them physically moved into new regions and settled there? Ancient DNA has answered this question clearly, at least in many parts of Europe, and the Paris Basin is one of the regions where this evidence is especially strong. Once again, genetic studies from this region show a substantial shift in ancestry during this Bronze Age period. Populations connected to this new steppe ancestry became a major part of the genetic makeup of people living in the Paris Basin. Thus, in a pattern very similar to what happened in Britain during this same general time, where the population responsible for building Stonehenge was, according to genetic research, replaced almost entirely within just a few centuries of finishing that famous monument. If you're finding it fascinating that this same story, a settled population vanishing and being replaced by strangers, keeps showing up in different parts of ancient Europe, please consider subscribing to this channel. We keep uncovering exactly these kinds of hidden and quiet dramas hiding inside old bones. It's worth understanding a little about why the steppe population was on the move in the first place, since it helps make the whole picture feel less abstract. The grasslands these people came from, stretching across parts of what's now Ukraine and southern Russia, were well suited to a very different way of life than farming. Instead of settling in one place to grow crops, these communities raised herds of animals, particularly cattle and horses, and this lifestyle allowed them to travel much greater distances than farming communities typically could. Some researchers believe that changes in climate, along with the simple advantages of raising large herds of livestock, allowed this population to grow rapidly and then expand outward in multiple directions across Europe over the course of just a few centuries. When a population capable of this kind of rapid growth and long-distance movement encountered smaller, more settled farming communities, the numbers alone would have mattered enormously, even without any single dramatic clash between the two groups. Now, it's important that we're careful and honest about exactly what this evidence shows, and just as important, what it doesn't show. Ancient DNA can tell us, with real confidence, that the genetic makeup of a region changed sharply within a short period of time. What it cannot tell us, at least not on its own, is exactly what happened to the earlier population. Did they die from diseases carried by the newcomers, diseases their bodies had never encountered before? Did they simply have fewer children survive, generation after generation, while the newcomers thrived and grew in number? Was there violence involved? Researchers have considered all of these possibilities, and honestly, the most likely answer is probably some combination of all of them, rather than any single simple cause. What we can say with confidence is that whatever happened, it wasn't a gentle, peaceful blending of two communities slowly becoming one family over many generations. The genetic record is simply too sudden and too complete for that gentler explanation to hold up. There's a helpful way to think about this Bronze Age shift too, one that connects it to a story many people have already heard of. In Britain, during this exact same general period, researchers made a very similar discovery involving Stonehenge, that famous circle of enormous standing stones. The people who organized the incredible effort of building Stonehenge, hauling massive stones many miles using nothing but timber, rope, and teamwork, were themselves farmers with deep roots in the British landscape. Yet within just a few centuries of finishing that monument, genetic studies show their descendants made up only a small fraction of the population that came after them. A new population, connected to this same steppe ancestry moving through Europe at the time, became the dominant group instead. The story near Paris follows this same basic shape, a settled, capable population, replaced by newcomers within a surprisingly short window of time, happening on both sides of the English Channel at roughly the same moment in history. There's something worth sitting with here, something that goes beyond just this one region near Paris. For a very long time, historians assumed that if you wanted to understand who lived in a place today, you could reasonably trace a fairly straight line back through history, back to whoever first settled that same land many thousands of years ago. Ancient DNA keeps showing us that this straight line usually isn't there at all. Instead, history looks more like a series of chapters with one population settling a place, living there for centuries, and then, sometimes quite abruptly, being replaced by an entirely different group of people who happened to arrive next. The land stays the same. The people living on it, from one era to the next, are often far less connected than anyone ever assumed. This matters for how we think about identity and heritage, too. People living near Paris today, understandably, feel connected to the deep history of that land, to the ancient farmers who first cleared the fields, and to the later arrivals who eventually became their own ancestors. And that connection to place is real and meaningful. But if you're looking for an unbroken chain of direct descent, stretching all the way back to the very first farmers who settled this land 6,000 years ago, the genetic evidence suggests that chain was broken, not once, but at least twice, by two entirely separate waves of newcomers who left little genetic trace of the people who came before them. It's also worth mentioning that this pattern wasn't perfectly identical everywhere researchers have looked, which is actually a useful thing to know, because it shows this isn't simply a single uniform story being applied blindly across the whole continent. In some parts of Europe, particularly further south, in places like Spain, genetic continuity with the earlier farming population remained noticeably stronger, even as this same bell beaker pottery style spread widely through the region. This suggests that in some places, the new pottery and customs spread mostly through trade and cultural influence, being adopted by people who were already living there, while in other places, including it seems the Paris Basin in Britain, the change came along with an actual overwhelming wave of new people replacing the population that had been there before. This kind of regional difference is exactly the sort of detail that makes historians confident this evidence reflects something real happening on the ground, rather than researchers simply finding a pattern they expected to find everywhere they looked. It's also worth mentioning why this kind of discovery took so long to make. For most of the last century, archaeologists studying ancient European history had to rely on what they could dig up and observe directly, things like pottery styles, tools, and burial customs. These are useful clues, but they have a real limitation. A brand new population moving into a region can sometimes adopt the pottery style or burial customs of the people who were already living there, at least for a little while, simply because it's convenient or familiar. This means that looking only at pottery and tools, a complete population replacement can sometimes look, on the surface, like nothing. Much happened at all. It's only with the arrival of ancient DNA testing, over just the past 15 years or so, that researchers have finally been able to look past the pottery and the tools and directly measure whether the people themselves, not just their belongings, actually changed. This helps explain why the old assumption of gentle, continuous population history lasted as long as it did. It wasn't that earlier researchers were careless. They simply didn't have access to the kind of evidence that could reveal this hidden layer of the story. Ancient DNA has only recently given historians a genuinely new set of eyes, allowing them to see something that was always there in the historical record, but that no one had the tools to properly notice before now. There's a gentler way to think about all of this, too, one that doesn't have to feel unsettling. Every one of us alive today descends from an unbroken chain of people who survived, adapted, and carried on, generation after generation, through countless changes we'll never fully know about. Whether your own ancestors were the farmers who first settled a piece of land, or the newcomers who arrived generations later and made that same land their own, both stories are simply part of being human. The people buried at Gurji lived full lives, raised families, and were loved by the people around them, just as much as anyone who came after them. Their story didn't need to continue through direct descendants for it to have mattered. It mattered because they lived it, and now, thousands of years later, their bones are finally able to tell us a piece of that story we would never have known otherwise. So, the next time you think about the deep, quiet countryside surrounding Paris, it's worth remembering what the bones buried beneath, that soil, are actually telling us. Twice, in this one small corner of the world, A settled population built their lives, raised their families, and buried their dead, fully expecting, as anyone naturally would, that their descendants would carry on in that same place for generations to come. And twice, within what was likely just a handful of generations each time, strangers arrived and became the dominant population instead, leaving behind almost no genetic trace of the people who had lived there before them. The fields near Paris look peaceful and unchanging today. According to the DNA hidden in the ground beneath them, their history was anything but.